Greetings, mortals. Today, I tell you how to write better backstories and how to become a better GM by doing less work. Welcome to Tabletop Sandbox, where we talk about all things TTRPG. I am a teller of tales, a chronicler of folly, also known as Harrison Tarr. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like on the video. That helps us out here. So, most of you probably already know this, or at least have heard some bozo on the internet scream it out loud. Player character backstories can, they don't always, but they can make a campaign so much better. And now, I know a lot of people have qualms about player backstories. Specifically in the OSR, people feel like, oh no, backstories, the long backstories that people try to write for 5e, that's a modern invention and it is not necessary. But I'm gonna tell you why it may not be necessary, but it can actually be awesome and super helpful as a GM. But just to address, some people have complaints about backstories. Like that they make level 1 characters seem way too powerful if they have a bunch of heroic stuff happening before they even start adventuring. Or that the backstory really doesn't have any major connections to the campaign world. And let me tell you, most of these problems can be fixed by a little bit of communication between the GM and the players. And I'll get into a little bit more specifics in a second here. Some people also say they're just not necessary for play. All you need is a simple background and an idea of who you want your character to be, and you can just go with that. Or some people even say that it's just too much reading. But I mean, come on. We're supposed to be fantasy nerds here. You're afraid of a little reading? A few pages? You're telling me that you haven't read through thousands of pages of fantasy series already? Watched hours and hours of movies? Like I said, most of those problems can be solved by a little bit of Like I said, most of those problems can be solved by a little bit of communication and collaboration between the game master and the players. When you're playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons, the storytelling and the creativity shouldn't just be on the shoulders of the game master. It should be split between the game master and the players. Now, I think that game masters should have final say in what goes down. I think that's a right and a privilege that you get by offering to be the game master and running the game, but that doesn't mean that you have to decide every single thing that happens. You don't have to be the only one having creative input in the world. So here's how I think it should go at the beginning of a new campaign. Involve the players in the campaign when you start it. First, I think that the game master should send out a campaign primer. I have a whole video about what you should include in a campaign primer that you can check out linked in the description. But basically, it gives all the information that the player is going to need when they're creating their character and writing that backstory. And it gives them a little bit of information about the world, so when they're writing their backstory, they can make their character fit into the setting that you have prepped. So once that player has the primer, then they can create their character and write their backstory. And then, before the campaign even starts, they send that backstory back to you to look over. And so as you're preparing the campaign, you get these player backstories in, and you can look at those backstories and begin implementing the things that are included in that player's backstory into the world. Now, this isn't a necessity and shouldn't be a requirement, both as the GM and the way that you run your games and from the players. Even if you're a GM who wants to run a game where you're incorporating player backstories into the game, you shouldn't require an entire backstory from your players. You should just require a basic description of their background and their motivations. Just a paragraph or so that allows you to understand who this character is and what they're trying to achieve. That can sometimes be enough. Then, once the game master has received those backstories and works towards implementing them into the game, into the campaign, that's when you can start play. But how exactly do you write a good backstory? Or not necessarily a good backstory, but one that is useful to to the DM. Because you can have a backstory that is a literary masterpiece, but if it doesn't include a few of these things that I'm about to get into, then it's really not useful to the game master. So what makes a good backstory? Well, first, in a game where you're leveling up, like 5e, and you start at first level, which is basically a nobody, and you slowly get more powerful and more able to take on heroic challenges, don't put those heroic challenges, don't put heroic deeds into your backstory already. Now, I don't mean don't make your character somebody who's a good person and who has the capacity for heroism, but have them pull somebody out of the way of a dragon's breath weapon in their backstory. Don't have them slay that dragon, because that just doesn't make any sense. How would a level 0 character, they're not even level 1 yet, how would they slay a dragon by themselves? It just make it fit in the verisimilitude of the game. Don't contradict the mechanics with the fiction. The fiction and the mechanics should work together to tell a story. You shouldn't tell a story and then regret at how the mechanics don't back it up. Next, you want to include a background. This might seem fairly obvious that you want to include a background in your backstory, but this is probably for those people who don't actually want to write a whole backstory. All you really need is a background and a motivation. So just come up with what your character did before they decided to become an adventurer. You know, they were a tailor, they were a washerwoman, they were a student at a university. Then come up with a reason why they left their former life, their former occupation, and turned to adventuring. Maybe they're seeking glory. Maybe there was a tragedy that befell them and they're seeking revenge. Or maybe they've just lost their opportunity and have to make a complete 180 in the way that they live their life. Like a professor getting fired from the university they teach at. Or the technology of crossbows making an archery instructor's job obsolete. But come up with that reason why they turned to adventure. And if it's not already included in that reason, include a motivation of what they hope to achieve in the course of their adventuring career, or even just immediately. Personally, when I'm writing a backstory, I like to include at the very end an immediate goal, a short-term goal, and a long-term goal, which is kind of immediate goal is like what I want to achieve in the first few sessions. A medium-length goal is something you hope to achieve at some point in the campaign. And then a long-term goal is something that if your character survives, you hope to achieve by the end of the campaign. Those are things that are very actionable, very useful and tangible that the GM can take and work into the story, or at least provide you the opportunities to achieve those. Another thing that can make your backstory very useful and actionable to the GM is including something, I'm not sure where I heard this term the first time, but something that I like to call knives into a backstory. These are things that the GM can take from your backstory and weaponize against that player. And you think, well, why would I want to do that? But the essence of a good story is conflict. And giving your GM examples or even tangible instances of conflict that they can throw at you as a player makes those challenges much more personal and much more emotionally engaging than if they're trying to come up with their own on the fly. So include knives. Include knives. These can be things like rivals or enemies or sworn nemeses. Nemesis is the plural of nemesis, correct? But knives don't have to be enemies of the player characters. They can also be loved ones or friends or allies. These are ways that the GM can take an aspect of the player character's backstory and turn them against them, stab them in the heart, metaphorically. You put someone's loved one in danger, that is a much more engaging and tantalizing plot hook than the random blacksmith's daughter. Now, that's not necessarily a bad one, but in a silly game like this, it can be hard to feel that emotional connection to a real human if they're not actually a real human. You know, it's just a game. So somebody that you don't know, that you haven't formed any emotional bonds with because there's no backstory, including them. There's no interaction that you've really had with them, or maybe you just saw them once. That's a lot harder to make your players care about than pulling a loved one from their backstory and putting them in danger. Now, if you're a player and you have somebody in your backstory that you really don't want harm to come to, you don't want them to be put in danger, you just want them to be an aspect of your backstory, that's okay. That's allowed. Just communicate that to your game master so that they can take your feelings and your wants into consideration. I'll say it again and again. The best way to ensure that you have the best role-playing experience possible is communication. You can't just expect everybody to know what you're cool with and what you would rather not have happen. So go out of your way to communicate that, and GMs, go out of your way to listen when a player comes to you and says, hey, this is something that I really wouldn't like to happen. Or, hey, this is something that I am really interested in seeing happen. Take those moments and use them, because taking those things that your players feel strongly about and including them in the campaign, that is the best way to ensure that your players are engaged and that they care about what's actually happening. Now, I've found that the people who have no interest in writing a backstory generally don't have that much interest in playing the game. In my experience, backstories are a fun opportunity for players to stretch their creative muscles. And I am more than happy to let them do that because they're having fun. And that's what I want for my friends when we're not just playing at the table, but playing a TTRPG. You should expect at least a background from each of your players. It doesn't have to be too much. But if they want to write a backstory, allow them, encourage them, because that can be useful to you as the GM. But again, do not force it. Do not require it from your players. It should be an opportunity for them to engage in this act of creativity, not a homework assignment. But enough about making useful backstories. How, as the GM, do you actually utilize them? How do you take that backstory, that information that your players give you, and apply it to the campaign? Now, I get it. It's a little bit more reading, or maybe a lot more reading if you have a player who decides to write a 6-page backstory the moment you announce a new campaign and includes 11 siblings, each with their own name and personality. But generally, it's not that much reading, maybe a couple pages, and in the end, it's actually gonna mean less prep for you as the game master. It's a lot easier to read something somebody else wrote than to come up with a bunch of new ideas on your own, at least in my experience. Maybe you're a genius. But what do I mean when I say backstories make less prep for the GM? Well, let me tell you a little secret about backstories. Even if the players don't know it when they're writing them, backstories are a cheat sheet telling you exactly what the players are going to have fun dealing with in your game. Anything that they write into their backstory is something that they thought about long enough to write down and that they will care about and find interesting if you introduce it into the game. It is a treasure trove of plot hooks and interesting characters and just details that your players are going to find fun if you introduce into your game. Now, you don't have to take everything from your characters' backstories. In fact, you don't even have to interpret it the same way that your players did. One of my favorite things is taking a few details from a character's backstory and turning them on their head, making them something that that player didn't expect to happen, or that they interpreted in a way that I interpreted differently, and so they assume they have this relationship with this character. Maybe it's a childhood rival, but it turns out that after a few years thinking back on those interactions as children, that person came back and they have a completely different mindset about it. They say, sure, maybe you were a little rough around the edges, but I learned a lot from those experiences, and they consider your character a friend when your character considered them a rival. Or taking something that maybe your player just guessed at or left vague in their backstory and really developing that and drawing on the characters and the interesting details of their backstory and making it even more involved and pulling them into a story that is uniquely tailored to them. That is something that I find really interesting and easy because I'm taking ideas that somebody else had and just playing off of them. And it's also incredibly engaging for your players. And if you're able to do so, it's really fun to take individual threads from a bunch of different players' backstories, unassociated with one another, and braid them together, all coalescing around the same interesting event. You've taken your players' creativity, a few ideas that they had that they put in their backstory, and brought it into reality with your interpretation of their backstory in the campaign. However, I should be clear, you shouldn't rewrite anything in their backstory. If they are clear about something, you shouldn't say, no, that's actually not what happened. You only thought you saw him get shot through the chest with a crossbow bolt and die. In fact, he's alive and fine because that was a body double. You don't want to just undermine a player's creativity and the details that they put into stone in their backstory. You want to take that creativity and use it, not subvert it. This form of collaboration, specifically collaborative storytelling, gives players a lot more ownership over their own characters and what happens in the course of the campaign. And as I said, it is much less prep work as a game master to steal from the players their ideas and, steal, you're really just utilizing the stuff that they've given you and write that into the campaign in a plot line that you know is going to engage the players. And at least in my experience, this is something that makes the game more fun for everyone involved. And it really makes players feel valued when you take the thing that they wrote to you and you implement that into your campaign, into something that, if you're like me, you've put a lot of thought and time and effort into your campaign setting and your campaign. And to take your players and put that into the middle of that, take their backstories and include those details, I don't know if I'm just projecting, but that's a way for me to show my players that they matter, that their creativity is interesting and important to me. And like I said, this is a collaboration. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'll say it again and again. Communication is absolutely the most important thing to ensuring that you have a great TTRPG session and campaign. I hope this video helped you and inspires you to run your next campaign a little bit differently, or just to dig a little deeper into those player backstories that you've had sitting shared in your Google Drive and never really looked at much, other than the initial skim. And I hope I've given you players some idea on how to best write your backstory, or just advice for GMs to give your players when they're writing a backstory. Make sure to like the video if you liked the video. Comment if you have disagreements, agreements, examples of times you ran a game implementing backstories, a time when your GM took your backstory and made it into a part of the campaign. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, well, obviously subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, but also subscribe to our second channel, More TTSB, for more content dealing with TTRPGs. Specifically, I do live streams, and there may be more long-form content coming in the future. Well, I think that's all I have for you. I'm off to chronicle some more folly. Good night, mortals.